The little dash on the arc here stands for default flow in BPMN. How exactly does it work? The answer is not as straightforward as you may think. The devil is in the details, as we say here in Germany. Hi, my name is Andreas Hense and I make videos on business process automation. I'm very often asked about the exact semantics of the default flow at an exclusive and inclusive gateway in BPMN. The splitting exclusive gateway is also called XOR split, and the splitting inclusive gateway is also called OR split. We will start with the default flow at an XOR split because it's simpler. Let's look at an example in the Fundamentals of Business Process Modeling book. And let's look at the BPMN specification table 13.3 at the same time. In order to determine the outgoing sequence flow that receives the token, the conditions are evaluated in order. The first condition that evaluates to true determines the sequence flow the token is sent to. No more conditions are henceforth evaluated. If and only if none of the conditions evaluates to true, the token is passed on the sequence flow. Is passed on the default sequence flow. In case all conditions evaluate to false and a default flow has not been specified, an exception is thrown. First, we must talk about the order of evaluation. The order is not determined in the BPMN standard and is left to the implementation. In many models, and in this case, conditions should be evaluated from top to bottom. The conditions in this example look like they are mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. But beware, the conditions on the sequence flows are not formalized. They are simply comments to make the process model more readable. So there could be a condition like, there are mismatches, but we don't know if they can be corrected. In this case, all three conditions are evaluated to false and the default flow is taken. Now let's look at a variation of the last diagram. The default flow is now the second from the top. This would mean that in the case that all conditions evaluate to false, the task resend invoice to customer would be chosen. But is this even possible in BPMN? Let's look at the specification. The default flow is the sequence flow that will receive a token when none of the condition expressions on other outgoing sequence flows evaluate to true. The default sequence flow should not have a condition expression. Any such expression shall be ignored. This indicates that the default flow always has an implicit condition of the Boolean constant true. It also means, for our current diagram with our assumed evaluation order from top to bottom, that the block invoice task could never be activated. This would be a modeling mistake. What are the implications for best practice in modeling XOR splits? First, always put the outgoing arcs of an XOR split in an order from top to bottom that corresponds to the evaluation order of the conditions. Second, always use a default flow. Third, always put the default flow at the bottom. Now let's switch to the OR split, a completely different story. Let's again look at an example of the Fundamentals in Business Process Modeling book, and let's look at the BPMN specification table 13.3 at the same time. In order to determine the outgoing sequence flows that receive a token, all conditions on the outgoing sequence flows are evaluated. The evaluation does not have to respect a certain order. For every condition which evaluates to true, a token must be passed to the respective sequence flow. If and only if none of the conditions evaluates to true, the token is passed on the default sequence flow. In case all conditions evaluate to false and the default flow has not been specified, the inclusive gateway throws an exception. In our example, we would evaluate if the order contains typical Amsterdam products or typical Hamburg products. We assume that the order can also contain general products that are neither Amsterdam or Hamburg. If any order contains general products, then the default flow would kick in and the suborder would be forwarded to Hamburg. Our second example comes from the workflow patterns. Here we have a process model that starts with answer emergency call. And then we have this OR split, and we have three different branches, one for police, one for fire engine, and one for ambulance. And depending on the nature of the emergency call, we will look at what kind of vehicles we need. So we can dispatch a police vehicle, we'll dispatch a fire engine, or dispatch an ambulance. And it makes perfect sense to look at what kind of combination of vehicles are necessary, and that in the case that we do not specifically need a police car, but we don't need a fire engine and don't need an ambulance, that we dispatch a police car. But what does the BPMN specification say? The default flow is the sequence flow that will receive a token when none of the condition expressions on other sequence flows evaluate to true. The default sequence flow should not have a condition expression. Any such expression shall be ignored. It's almost the same thing that was said about the default flow for the XOR split. Does this make sense here? Let's look at the examples again. If we are not allowed to put a condition on the default flow here, then the diagram has to be modified to this. And the second example, this is again with a condition on the default flow. And this is without the condition on the default flow. I don't think it improves the readability of the process diagrams. What are the implications? For XOR splits, it is okay not to have a condition on the default flow because the default flow can only be the last in the evaluation order anyway, and it must be evaluated to true. For OR splits, however, the restriction does not make much sense and leads to less readable process models. Probably the BPMN specification should be modified here. What is your opinion on this? Feel free to write me a comment. Thank you for watching.